They sealed his garage shut, trapping him inside. He had to break out to survive the HOA's wrath. In the quiet, orderly neighborhood of Elmwood Heights, Colorado, where every driveway was spotless and every garage door gleamed, 48-year-old Brian Mitchell lived a simple, hard-working life. Brian, a single father and freelance carpenter, used his garage as both a workshop and storage space for his tools, materials, and a few personal items, like his late father's old motorcycle. The garage was cluttered but functional, shelves lined with paint cans, a workbench covered in sawdust, and stacks of lumber neatly arranged in the corner. It wasn't pretty, but it was Brian's livelihood, the place where he built furniture to support himself and his 16-year-old daughter Lily. On weekends, Brian often left the garage door open while he worked, the hum of his saw blending with the sounds of birds chirping in Elmwood Heights. But the Elmwood Heights Homeowners Association saw Brian's garage as a problem. The HOA president, 62-year-old Margaret Steele, a retired accountant with an iron grip on the neighborhood's rules, had a long-standing bylaw that stated garages must remain free of clutter and used solely for vehicle parking to maintain the community's aesthetic. It was a rule rarely enforced. Many residents stored bikes, tools, or holiday decorations in their garages, but Margaret had grown tired of seeing Brian's mess through his open garage door, especially after a neighbor complained that it lowered property values. Margaret believed it was her duty to keep Elmwood Heights pristine, even if it meant crossing boundaries. In September 2024, Margaret sent Brian a letter citing the bylaw and demanding that he clear out his garage within 72 hours or face a $1,200 fine for improper use of garage space. The letter also warned that failure to comply would result in corrective action by the HOA. Brian was furious. His garage was his workspace, and moving everything would disrupt his business. He called Margaret, explaining that he needed the space for his carpentry work and that he couldn't afford to rent a separate storage unit. He offered to keep the garage door closed when he wasn't working to appease the HOA. But Margaret was unmoved. "A garage is for cars, not junk," she snapped. "Clear it out or we'll handle it." Brian refused, thinking the HOA wouldn't dare take drastic action over a cluttered garage. He was wrong. On a chilly Tuesday morning, while Brian was inside his garage working on a custom bookshelf, a team of HOA contracted workers arrived at his property. Without warning, they slammed the garage door shut, wrapped it with heavy-duty red tape labeled HOA violation, do not open, and secured it with industrial-grade padlocks. Inside, Brian heard the commotion and rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. He banged on it, yelling, "Hey, I'm in here! Open the door!" But the workers ignored him, following Margaret's orders to secure the violation. The garage had no windows, and the side door to the house was blocked by a stack of lumber Brian had been meaning to move. The air grew stuffy, and Brian's phone had no signal inside the concrete walls. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped. For nearly 2 hours, Brian shouted for help, his voice growing hoarse. His tools were scattered, but he found a sledgehammer in the corner and began smashing the garage door, splintering the wood to create a hole big enough to crawl through. By the time he escaped, covered in sweat and sawdust, his hands were bleeding from the effort, and the garage door was a mangled mess. Waiting outside was a notice, a $1,200 fine for the garage violation, plus an additional $800 for damages to HOA property. The tape and locks, signed by Margaret Steele. Brian was livid, but also shaken. He could have suffocated if he hadn't broken out. Lily came home from school just as Brian emerged, her eyes widening in horror as she saw her dad and the ruined door. "Dad, what happened?" she cried, dropping her backpack to hug him. A neighbor, 40-year-old nurse Sarah Collins, witnessed the aftermath and filmed Brian's escape on her phone, capturing his bloody hands in the taped-up garage door. She posted the video on X with the caption, "The HOA trapped my neighbor in his garage. This is dangerous. Garage lockout." The video went viral, gaining 9 million views in 48 hours, with the hashtag trending nationwide. People were outraged, calling the HOA's actions reckless and inhumane. Local news stations in Denver covered the story, interviewing a shaken Brian, who said, "I thought I was going to die in there. Over some tools?" The reporter also spoke to a safety expert who warned that trapping someone in a confined space without ventilation could lead to serious injury or death. The community erupted in anger. Sarah organized a protest outside the HOA office, where dozens of residents gathered with signs reading, "Garages aren't prisons," and "Stop HOA danger." Some brought tools like hammers and saws, holding them up as symbols of Brian's fight. A GoFundMe page to help Brian repair his garage door and pay the fines raised $10,000 in a week, with donors leaving messages like, "HOAs are a menace," and "Justice for Brian." The story caught national attention, with outlets like NBC and the New York Times running headlines like, "HOA traps man in garage over clutter," and "Colorado carpenter fights for freedom after HOA lockout." Brian decided to sue the HOA, hoping to hold Margaret accountable and get compensation for the trauma and damages. He hired a lawyer, Kevin Patel, who argued that the HOA's actions constituted false imprisonment, reckless endangerment, and property damage, and that the garage rule was arbitrarily enforced as other residents stored items without issue. The lawsuit sought $15,000 in damages, the removal of the fine, and an injunction to prevent further HOA interference. The case drew a crowd to the courtroom, with supporters wearing work gloves in solidarity. Kevin presented Sarah's video as evidence, along with medical reports showing Brian's injuries from breaking out. Brian took the stand, his voice steady but emotional. "I was trapped in my own home. They put my life at risk over some shelves." Margaret, representing the HOA, showed no remorse. She claimed the garage rule was meant to maintain community standards and that Brian's non-compliance justified the HOA's actions. She produced the bylaw and argued that the HOA had the right to enforce its rules, even with extreme measures. The judge, a strict interpreter of HOA contracts, ruled in favor of the HOA, stating that the bylaw was legally binding and the HOA had the authority to secure the garage after issuing a warning. The fine was upheld, and Brian was ordered to pay the HOA's legal fees, an additional $5,000 burden. Brian left the courtroom in disbelief, Lily holding his hand as he whispered, "What's next? They lock me in my own house?" The ruling fueled public outrage, with number garage lockout trending again, this time with calls for HOA reform. Safety advocates and legal experts condemned the decision, arguing that it endangered residents' rights and safety. In Elmwood Heights, Margaret remained HOA president, issuing new rules requiring monthly garage inspections, with fines doubled to $2,400 for violations. Brian used the GoFundMe money to repair his garage door, but he stopped working in the garage, afraid of further retaliation. Lily started having nightmares about her dad being trapped, and the once welcoming neighborhood became a place of fear. Elmwood Heights, once a peaceful haven, turned into a battleground, with residents wondering how far the HOA would go to enforce its control.